For the past 2 days, we've been showing you amazing video clips from David Suzuki's dramatic appearance on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. It's amazing and dramatic because unlike the gentle reverence with which Suzuki and his kooky ideas are treated in Canada, down under in Australia, they actually asked him some tough questions. Tough questions, but not rude questions. Suzuki was the rude one, accusing all of his critics of being paid off by oil companies or GMO companies. Nah, the Australians were just being persistent, and they knew their facts much better than Suzuki did. Well, today we're going to finish up the 3-day series with a few more clips from that appearance. I call them Suzuki's deep thoughts. Not his fumbling answers to specific questions that he totally flubbed, but what Suzuki said when he was asked open-ended questions like, how do we save the world? His answers were so weird, you're going to laugh. Before we do that, though, I think I cracked the code on something really weird that Suzuki said in yesterday's show that just didn't make any sense to me at the time. Here's the clip. Remember, Suzuki was talking about the urgent need for wind turbines. So urgent that we can't even take the time to build nuclear reactors instead. Look.
Far better to say, look, we've got 1,000 Pearl Harbors going off at once, and we can't even wait for nuclear now. We've got to go full tilt.
Do you know what that means? I sure didn't yesterday. I puzzled over it. Pearl Harbor, of course, was where the Japanese made a sneak attack on the American Navy in Hawaii in 1941, killing thousands of people and pushing the U.S. into the war. So what on earth does Suzuki mean by 1,000 Pearl Harbors going off at once? And because of that, we can't wait for nuclear power plants to be built. Well, I think I've got it. It's so lame, you're going to be embarrassed for the old man. Here. Take a look at a truly world-class eco-huckster who made this statement back in June of this year.
That means that the total amount of man-made global warming pollution surrounding the planet and the atmosphere today now traps enough extra energy every 24 hours to equal the energy released by 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs going off every single day.
Do you think that's what Suzuki was trying to say? Instead of 1,000 Pearl Harbors going off at once, that he was trying to say 400,000 Hiroshima bombs every day? Now, of course, it's junk science. It's classic Al Gore hucksterism, trying to scare people by talking about nuclear holocaust, by using atom bombs as a unit to measure the heat of our own sun. I mean, it's desperate fear-mongering. More to the point, since 1998, there has been no measurable global warming. It just stopped at 1998 and hasn't budged since. That's not an opinion. That's an observed fact by the UN's own Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the official scientists of global warming. Anyways, my point is that Al Gore is a first-rate huckster. His global warming propaganda movie, An Inconvenient Truth, it won an Oscar. I mean, the man himself won a Nobel Peace Prize. And more than any of that, he got absolutely filthy, stinking rich by selling carbon credits to dupes who were willing to pay him for the right to drive their own car. And in the final coup de grace, Gore unloaded his money-losing TV station called Current TV to Al Jazeera for a cool $500 million, of which Gore himself pocketed $70 million. Al Jazeera, of course, is owned by the Emirate of Qatar, an OPEC country that makes its money selling oil and gas, as in fossil fuels. So my point is, Al Gore is the master global warming propagandist. He's quite good, isn't he? But David Suzuki, well, I mean, he's a millionaire, sure, but he's nowhere near Al Gore's level. He's a copycat, trying hard to remember Gore's best lines and then to repeat them in Australia, hoping they haven't heard Gore before, but he can't quite remember the punchline of the joke the way Gore told it, could he? Anyways, there's one more thing I want to show you first. Before rolling out Suzuki's new deep thoughts. Remember a week ago, Laurie Goldstein and I showed you David Suzuki saying something really creepy on the streets of Vancouver. Here, take a look at this videotape again.
We have a government, the Harper government, that has that wants to expand the prison system in spite of the fact that crime rates are dropping. Now, I'm not a guy that tends to think that there are all these obscure things that are going on we don't know about, but quite frankly, are we expanding the prison system because the Harper government intends to create new areas of criminality? How about eco-terrorists? How about radical extremists? Is that what's going to fill our jails in the coming years?
Yeah, Suzuki was saying that he thought the conservative government that he so desperately hates him back so much that they're building new super prisons in which to house environmental activists like him. Now, Lori Goldstein and I laughed at that when we saw it a week or two ago, but I guess Suzuki was so pleased with how his conspiracy theory was received by the junkies and hobos on Vancouver Street that he thought he'd try the line out again on Australian TV. Remember this craziness?
In Canada, I'm afraid we're leading the way now in the world. We now have a government that is making a major commitment to increasing the number of prisons at a time when the rate of crime has been dropping steadily over the last 10 years. So I'm wondering, I'm not a guy that thinks about conspiracies, but I'm wondering whether our Prime Minister thinks he's going to be creating new categories of crime like eco-terrorism or, as he calls us, environmental radicals, radical extremists. But anyway, there is a very strong...
With all due respect, that does sound like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah. In my moments, I do kind of wonder.
Now, it's one thing for him to have told the hobos in Vancouver that Stephen Harper is going to throw environmentalists in jail for being environmentalists. I mean, it's embarrassing, but it's really just that an Occupy Vancouver group of ragamuffins. But then he tried that line out on Australian national TV, where he was treated and received as a respected and reputable guest. Well, that kind of weirdness was actually noticed back home here in Canada, maybe by people in Ottawa watching our show, I don't know. So here is what the Justice Minister of Canada, Peter MacKay, said yesterday in response to Suzuki's weird outburst.
I heard reports of this. It's absurd to suggest, as he has, that this is happening in Canada or would happen in Canada. I want to clarify one thing. We have not and do not intend to build more prisons or mega prisons. This is, again, pure mythology. David Suzuki is a public figure. He's entitled to his opinions, but to deliberately spread mistruths in another country about our justice system, I suggest, is inappropriate and irresponsible. Something he can't be jailed for, but it is something that he should seriously ponder before he makes such absurd comments about our system.
Seriously, I mean, first Suzuki mumbled something weird about Pearl Harbor. And then he says he thinks the government is going to throw him in prison, imaginary prisons that the government isn't even building, or maybe they are secret prisons that only Suzuki knows about, that only he can see. Hey, David, maybe it's time to retire and just enjoy your 3 houses, eh? Huh. We're talking about David Suzuki's stunning appearance on Australian television earlier this week. Stunning because he was actually asked real questions by real journalists, something that never happens in Canada, and he just plain flubbed them, all of them, brutally. He had no clue. He lashed out bizarrely with personal attacks or conspiracy theories. He tried goofy jokes and stories that probably work well with his young interns, but that the Australians just rolled their eyes at. It was wonderful. The first time Suzuki had a real interview ever. How embarrassing for journalists in Canada that it had to happen in another country. Anyways, by this time in the interview, Suzuki was pretty much spent. He had been embarrassed with questions about global warming. He didn't know anything about the science, about the 15-year pause in global warming, or even the names of the universities and other expert authorities that were compiling the research. It was rough. And then, as we showed you yesterday, he was absolutely schooled in his own field of genetics by proponents of GMO food. Here's just a quick reminder of how painfully embarrassing that was on Suzuki's claim that GMO food are nothing but a get-rich-quick scheme by scientists. Look.
I'm just saying, what's the rush? The rush is being driven, I believe, by money, not so much about improving nutrition. Well, I mean, that is always the argument that's made. GMOs are very, very expensive. Now, the people that need this food are not going to be able to afford it. Are we going to just create these new crops and then give them away? I simply don't believe that's what's going to happen. I don't think it's a generosity for the rest of humanity that is driving this activity.
Actually, we are. I mean, BT corn technology has been given away to the Kenyan state government research people for use for subsistence farmers. Monsanto gave away insect-resistant potatoes in Mexico over 20 years ago.
Our project is funded by the Gates Foundation. Yes, the plants will be given away for free. No, they won't be forced on anybody.
If that's just a quick summary, you saw the full 15-minute back and forth yesterday in our show. It was absolutely brutal. So after that embarrassment about global warming and then his shellacking about GMO foods, I think the host of the show started to take some pity on Suzuki and just asked him some feel-good questions that really required no research or knowledge at all. I mean, he sounds like he hasn't read a scientific journal in years, so why keep torturing the man with real scientific questions? So they went all touchy-feely, like this.
The doom and gloom around environmental and social issues can demotivate people and make them feel like the problem is beyond their control. What lessons can you share with us from around the world here in Australia about how we can change that and help people achieve positive change for a more compassionate and sustainable future, despite where our governments are leading us?
Yeah, well, I agree. Back in the 70s and 80s, people like me used to run around, you know, citing that slogan, think globally and act locally. And for level in Canada, one of the biggest things that I see is urban agriculture. Canada is a northern country, and yet we've got used to the idea of thinking we can go to the store and get fresh fruit and vegetables 12 months a year. And people are beginning to realize, no, you know, in the winter we go to the canned goods section if we want vegetables and fruits. That's the way it should be. So we're paying much more attention to locally, organically grown food in the city itself. And it's being driven by young people.
So one of the biggest things he sees, he was asked, what big ideas, is urban agriculture. As in city hipsters wearing ironic t-shirts and carrying around important notebooks for their poetry, those kids pretending to be farmers. As in like this guy.
Just Food is a nonprofit organization in New York City that works to holistically bring about food system change so that we have a food system that we want to see. It's looking at the entire food system and figuring out how can we not only fix the conventional corporate food system, but also how can we create alternative models that'll kind of replace it. It's not just chickens and chicken coops, it's communities taking back land in the communities and organizing and creating spaces that are beautiful in more ways than just healthy food, but also in terms of events and being a space where people can organize and talk about what's important. Food justice is about people having the right to eat healthy, nutritious food, and food sovereignty is about people being able to decide where that food comes from, how it's produced, and being able to grow it themselves.
Did you see how gross that was? Raising chickens in some half-cleaned up slum in New York? But was that chicken his livestock or his pet there? Look, New York is a city of 8 million people. Are you going to have millions of chickens and, I don't know, maybe cows in little backyards or balconies? How gross is that? Or even if you're not really creepy like that guy was, and if you just stick to fruits and vegetables, do you seriously think that you can feed a city, even a city like Vancouver, where Suzuki is from, with 2 million people in the urban area? Do you think you can grow potatoes or carrots to feed 2 million people in the city? Is that with or without pesticide in the grime of the city with 1 million cars? But Suzuki was serious here, I think. He said that urban agriculture was his big idea, for people to either grow their own food or, as he said, to use canned foods in the winter. He said it. He said that's the way it should be, he said. Apparently he's against importing food, but why? I mean, we don't just import food because we like pineapples and we can't grow them in Canada. We import food because sometimes it's much, much cheaper for food to be made somewhere else, like where it's warmer, like California or Mexico, and then shipped here in bulk. It's actually so efficient that it's much cheaper than trying to grow it in Canada. It's also much more efficient if you care about the environment to have a large-scale farm where it's supposed to be, in the country, rather than having hundreds of hipsters playing farmer with their 100-square-foot back alley plots. I'll stop my criticism there, though I could go on, but say you're some Australian gal. You were told this amazing Canadian scholar and genius environmentalist had jetted in. You were invited to a grand Australian Broadcasting Corporation town hall with him. And you were selected to ask a question. And that was the great guru's advice? That urban farming is the next big thing? How disappointing, how shocking. Really, those Australians must think we're absolute fools to treat such a charlatan as some sort of hero back here at home. But let me move on. Suzuki had more advice. Here's what he told Australians that his national political role model is.
In Ecuador has enshrined Pachamama in their constitution. And what that means is Pachamama, Mother Earth, has constitutional rights to exist. Now, in the southern part of Ecuador is a river called the Vilcabamba, which is considered to have properties that allow you to live longer if you live and drink Vilcabamba water. And so, of course, there are a lot of Americans that have moved down there to live there. Because anyway.
You know, let's put aside the Vilcabamba story for a moment. I mean, no doubt every little tourist town has a legend about how pure its water is, that it's the stuff of life, the fountain of youth. That's what we call an old wives' tale, a myth, a tourism ploy. It's sort of the opposite of what you'd expect a scientist to be answering when he's asked about world models for environmentalism. How weird and disappointing. But what about that first part in his love letter to Ecuador? What about that Pachamama, about enshrining rights for Mother Earth right into the Ecuadorian constitution? Well, it's true. Ecuador did pass that legally meaningless statement, a PR sales tactic that Suzuki just ate up, didn't he? And boy, did Ecuador try to milk its new Mother Nature marketing exercise. Their socialist president, Rafael Correa, who was a great ally of the late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, by the way, thought that if he branded Ecuador as environmentalist, it could camouflage his other activities, like expropriating TV stations that were critical of his presidency, Chavez style. But get this part is weird, and it's totally David Suzuki. I think it's why Suzuki loves him so much. This Marxist Correa said that there was this beautiful, pristine, natural region in Ecuador called Yasuni Park, but there was oil in it. And here's the Suzuki-ish part. If the international community paid Korea $350 million a year, he wouldn't develop it. So he was an environmentalist of fortune. Hey, a bit like Al Gore, although unlike Gore, Correa actually won his presidential election. Well, what do you think happened? Do you think that the world paid President Correa its green ransom? Do you think anyone in the world would give a politician an annual payment of $1/3 billion not to chop down his own trees? Well, obviously no one paid. So this year, Correa gave up on his weird pay me to be green plan, and he decided to go auction off 3 million hectares of land to Chinese oil companies over the objections of Aboriginal tribes, mind you. Yeah, so much for Pachamama, Mother Earth. Looks like President Correa will sell out his own mama for a few $1 billion. But just like his climate science, just like his GMO science, Suzuki doesn't have a clue just how out of date he is. Suzuki really still thinks his hero, Rafael Correa, is protecting Mother Earth and sipping holy water from the Vilcabamba streams. Nope, David. He sold all that stuff to China. Okay, so chicken coops in New York City were weird, and living like they do in the movie Avatar in Ecuador was a bit fanciful. So what place does Suzuki truly know? As in, he's been there, maybe more than once. He's studied it. He really loves it. What place would David Suzuki call home if he didn't already live in an $8 million home in Vancouver and have 2 other $1 million homes? Remember, that was a question that girl in Australia. Do you have examples from around the world to inspire us? Well, he was only too happy to tell his Australian hosts this.
Okay, but everybody I'm sure has heard of Bhutan, this amazing country. And Bhutan offers a radically different perspective in that the king said what Bhutanese are interested in is not GNP, gross national product, but GNH, gross national happiness. Happiness and well-being is the purpose of governments, and the economy is there to serve those ends, not just steady growth forever. And that's something, again, I think worth looking to.
Yeah, but they did that pretty much by closing their doors to outside.
Well, their doors were closed, and they opened them, and they discovered to their amazement that the rest of the world regards progress and development as money. Their students started to come back to the country when they opened the gates and said, "You're not going to believe what they think development is." And the king said, "No, it's about happiness."
Gross national happiness, eh? Suzuki goes for the gimmicks, doesn't he? Giving Mother Nature legal rights, urban farming, gross national happiness, anything that sounds like a buzzword, anything that sounds fashionable or faddish, he's there. Pretty much the opposite of meticulous empirical science. He's a gimmicks man. Of course he is. He's an entertainer first, the scientist last. But he really seems to know Bhutan. I mean, he was there just a month or so ago.
So we have to rediscover that sense of belonging and connection with all things on the planet.
That's why only the new paradigm can make a difference.
I think that we can't tinker and say, oh, well, we need some new taxes here so that they won't pollute the water. I mean, we need those indicators. But it's a mind shift that says, wait, you can't do that to the water. The water is sacred. The water gives us life. It connects us to the rest of the world through the hydrologic cycle. You can't use it as a garbage can. I mean, that's the mind shift that the new paradigm, it seems to me, will give us. So I come here saying thank you to Bhutan. Thank you for doing what you're doing, because this isn't happening around the world. And even though you're a small and, compared to us, you're not a rich country, thank you for doing it and committing to doing that.
It was a really long interview. That was just a short clip. And look at all the buzzwords there. New paradigm, mind shift, sacred. He's not an empirical scientist. He's a wannabe mystic. He's a new age fad follower. And boy, he loves Bhutan. But is what he says true? Does Bhutan really have the secret that we all lack here in the West? That's what Suzuki told Bhutan's state media company there, the Bhutan Broadcasting Service, owned and controlled by the government. Well, let's see. Maybe the reason the King of Bhutan emphasizes its gross national happiness instead of its gross national product is because it doesn't have much of a gross national product. The average per capita GDP of Bhutan is $2,100 a year. You heard that right. The average person in Bhutan earns $5.75 a day. It's one of the most grindingly poor places on earth, ranked 169th out of all the world's countries. North Korea is ranked 125th. Just for comparison, Bhutan's life expectancy is in the 60s. It's ranked 159th in the world. It's lower than in North Korea. They're starving in North Korea. They're eating grass. But Bhutan is poorer. They die earlier. Barely half of Bhutanese people can read or write. Only 38% of women there can. 18% of children as young as 5 years old work as child laborers. Of course they do. They're starving. There are only 2 doctors for every 100,000 people in the country. You heard me right. 2 doctors for 100,000 people. If you get sick, you die. But Suzuki says it's all about the right, what's the word again? New paradigm mind shift. Yeah, sure. Bhutan is considered a high-risk country for infectious diseases. Sure, half the population is needed just to eke out enough subsistence agriculture on farms, but they're happy. Their king says so, and he's got this great slogan, gross domestic happiness, which, as luck would have it, you can't really measure. Well, actually, some people do try to measure happiness. The United Nations Human Development Index is an attempt to measure happiness. Bhutan is ranked 140th. But that's just money and health and life expectancy and literacy. But what about freedom? Let me quote from the NGO called Human Rights Watch, and I quote, Bhutan, even as it boasted of its high gross national happiness, has violated international laws protecting political freedom and those shielding against discrimination based on religion or ethnicity, attempting to create a homogenous culture. When minority ethnic Nepalis complained, Bhutan responded by forcing to exile more than 100,000 of its citizens with impunity. That's 1/7 of the country. Those that remained were silenced and terrified into submission. Well, so I guess that's 100,000 people who aren't happy? Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they all agree Bhutan is a de facto apartheid state. Here, let me read to you from another NGO called Freedom House, and I quote, "The government in the 1980s imposed restrictions on Nepali speakers, also known as South Bhutanese, to protect the culture of the ruling Nagalong Drukpa ethnic group. Tens of thousands of southern Bhutanese fled or were expelled to Nepal in the early 1990s, and soldiers raped and beat many villagers and detained thousands as anti-nationals. Bhutan is not an electoral democracy. The authorities restrict freedom of expression, and a 1992 law prohibits criticism of the king and the political system," unquote. What the hell is going on here? Why is David Suzuki, who, as you saw at the beginning of the show, rails against Canada because he has nightmares of our democratically elected prime minister, who's limited by the rule of law and our independent courts, building secret prisons to arrest him? Suzuki rants about that conspiracy theory, but he vocally supports a dictatorship that ethnically cleansed 1/7 of its population, where it's against the law to criticize the king. No wonder Suzuki was sucking up. Suzuki goes on the dictator's own TV station to praise him. What the hell? And how is living in squalor environmentalist? Forget that. How can he say it's happy? What on earth makes sense here? Well, look, back to how we started this whole thing. What does Suzuki want to be? Who does he style himself after? You know, that whole Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima thing? Does he want to be super rich, just like Al Gore? I mean, Suzuki is rich. His houses alone are worth $10 million. But does he want to be Al Gore rich? He charges $30,000 for a speech here in Canada and $75,000 for speeches in Australia. So why the love for Bhutan? Well, look at this. It's a travel agency website, as in a commercial venture, a business. This is a sales pitch. Look at what it's for. It's for a trip of a lifetime with David Suzuki to Bhutan for 22 lucky people. And the price tag? It starts at $6,800 per person, and that doesn't even include your airfare. So for a couple, that's a $13,600 bill for an 11-day holiday. So 6.5 years income for the average Bhutanese citizen. David Suzuki has a business in the dictatorship of Bhutan. It's part of his personal business plan, his wealth plan, his retirement plan. He won't make millions off it like Al Gore does with his ventures, but he'll take a healthy cut. He'll turn a blind eye to child labor, to the lack of education for women, to the ethnic cleansing of Nepalis, to the grinding poverty. He'll gloss over all of that, and he and his other 1%er friends will stay in luxury hotels and eat fine meals until their stomachs are full. Oh, and then he'll go on Bhutanese propaganda TV and praise the king and dictatorship. I'm not sure which is worse. Suzuki doing PR for a brutal monarchy right there in Bhutan, or Suzuki doing that same PR in Australia without disclosing his business interests in Bhutan. For 3 days, we've shown you the real David Suzuki, mainly who he isn't. He doesn't have a clue about climate science. He doesn't even know the most basic jargon or the names of the climate science institutions. And even in his own scientific discipline, genetics, he was utterly destroyed on the subject of GMO food. His answers to everything from fracking to immigration are emotional and childish, a standard operating procedure for him in Canada that he always got away with here, but that went over like a lead balloon on a real TV station in Australia. He's not a scientist. I don't think he even truly likes science because science is objective and apolitical. And Suzuki is as political and partisan as it gets, even cutting television ads for the Liberal Party's campaign. I don't think Suzuki even likes progress. He seems disappointed when GMO food is proven safe. He so desperately wants fracking to be found dangerous, even though the EPA says there is zero evidence of that. He clearly lusts for global warming to be happening and to be mankind's fault. It's as if he's rooting against people and against progress, even against the human race, saying there's too many of us as it is. Of course, there's an asterisk beside each of those points because he likes to do very well himself, economically, technologically, and he obviously wanted to have 5 children, even if he thinks the world is overpopulated. So if Suzuki isn't truly a scientist, well, then what is he? Well, I think he's a hero in his own mind, mystical, the kind of idiot who says buzzwords like new paradigm and sacred mind shift with grave pronunciation, and you're supposed to find great meaning in those buzzwords too. I think he believes that he's holy, that he's sacred, that he's saving the world, and that we should forgive him his hypocrisies because he is so great, so important, so rules shouldn't apply to him, and even his own moral condemnations of wealth shouldn't apply to him either. He's a legend in his own mind, a psychological condition that the fawning yes men of the CBC and the rest of Canada's media party have only added to over the past 40 years. But more than anything, more than everything, I think David Suzuki just likes all the attention, likes being a really big deal. Here's a videotape of him at some compound, cult leader style, back in the 1970s. Listen to him talk about how some people think, according to him.
One thing that I've gotten off on lately is that basically, I study fruit flies, and I suddenly realized that basically we're all fruit flies. Like, you're born as an egg, you hatch out as a maggot. And the bigger you get, the more people or more maggots you can crush with your weight. Most people in the world are content to stay as first or second level maggots. And they establish their own little area and they crawl around there, and that's fine. And the guys that become 10th level maggots are really big wheels.
Yeah, he said that. I'm always left speechless, or almost speechless, after watching that. David, you've done it. You're a joke as a scientist, an embarrassment as a Canadian abroad, but you have done it. You're a 10th level maggot. A really big deal.